Okay, welcome, Vinnie.
Thank you for having me, man. This is great.
Hey, thank you for being here. Thank you for being here. I know a lot of folks are eager to hear what you have to say, having read the book, having, maybe watched your movies, done all these things. I will do a quick bio for the sake of the recording here. Vinnie Tortorich has been a trainer in the fitness industry for over 35 years. He's the author of the best-selling book, Fitness Confidential. He hosts a popular podcast by the same name. He owns 3 health-focused companies, Pure Vitamin Club, Pure Coffee Club, and NSNG Foods. He's also the creator of 3 documentary films, Fat, a Documentary Part 2, and Beyond Impossible, which I was just rewatching last night. So please help me welcome Vinnie Tortorich.
Thank you. I feel all of the accolades that the clapping.
A lot of love for you, Vinnie.
Yeah, this is great, and thank you for inviting me on and for pushing my book. If you don't mind me saying, when I wrote that book, probably 12 years ago now, because the book has been out for over 10. There's an old saying that you should dance like no one's looking. And I wrote a book as if no one was going to ever read it. So I do apologize for some of what's in the book. In the first chapter, I'm talking about, massaging women's boobs. And had I known that the book would have taken off the way it did, I think I would have left that whole piece out. I would have left a lot out. And I would have probably added a lot more, which is what I ended up doing when the book became crazy popular. Much to my amazement, I realized that there was really no prescription in the book. It's like, wait a minute, I wrote a whole book and I didn't really tell people what to do. So I went back and wrote the PDF, and now we're calling it an ebook at vinnietortorich.com. But that was the piece that I should have added to the book. Luckily, I wrote that in one day. I was bored. I didn't have a lot to do that day. I started off the way I always do, with a fountain pen. Yes, a fountain pen, not a ballpoint pen. And the backs of envelopes. And I started jotting down info. And that became the PDF. So the whole thing has been this kind of, house that Jack built. I don't know if people still use that phrase, but I guess you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's funny because that was one of the notes I had. I dog-eared the page that had the prescriptive piece. I don't know if y'all can see that, but stay away from sugars, stay away from grains.
The whole book could have been one half of a page.
The entire advice.
Yeah.
So let's jump back, because I'm always curious, as an author myself and person who loves writing, I'm kind of curious. And the introduction is a very vivid description of your life as a fitness trainer, as a person who doesn't even own a couch, because you bike in front of your TV and you're all over LA and these celebrities' houses. So how do we get from that to deciding to write a book?
Around 2000, maybe even in the late 90s, one of my clients kept saying to me that, you have these incredible stories. My clients would always say to me, when I would take them on long hikes and all this kind of stuff, I said, you have these incredible stories. As a matter of fact, a lot of times the writers, they were all writing sitcoms at the time. I would say something funny or stupid or whatever, and they would say, oh, wait, is that yours? Meaning, did you make that up? And if I said yes, they would go, may I use it? So a lot of what I was saying was ending up in television. And some of those people started saying to me, you should be writing this down. Everyone kept telling me I was wasting my life as a trainer. And I always took umbrage with that, because it was my life's work. I mean, Ben Bocchicchio can, again, he could probably say the same thing. People would probably come up to him his whole life and said, you're wasting your life. It's like, how do you waste your life if you're teaching people something? Well, one client, her name was Lucy Johnson. She was the head of daytime television at CBS. She was a close friend and a client. And she kept saying to me, you need to write, you need to write, you need to write. I was like, I don't know how to write. And she signed me up for Christmas one year for a writing class, and I didn't go to it. I said, thank you, but no, thank you. I'm not going to go to the writing class. So she ended up using that course for herself. I gave the Christmas gift back to her. And she said, I said, listen, Lucy, and I felt bad about handing a Christmas gift back. So I said, what if I try to write something and I write this and then you'll realize that I can't write. And then we could just put this to bed. And I wrote something. It took me 2 nights or 3 nights to write it. I just wrote it out longhand. Lucy ended up typing it up for me. And I titled it The Help. This is long before the movie The Help came out. Because I felt like part of the staff, you know, for rich people in Hollywood. And that 13 or 14 page single space typed thing, I talked about 1 hour of one day in the life of me from the time I got to a client's house until the time I left. And that thing went around Hollywood. People started handing it around, agencies and the whole thing.
Wow.
And I started getting phone calls because Simon and Schuster got in a hold to it. Harper Wave, HarperCollins got a hold to it. A bunch of different places got a hold to it. And it was right after a book came out called You'll Never Eat in This Town Again, where this woman did a tell-all, an agent did a tell-all. So that was, and right after that, another book came out called The Nanny Diaries, where these nannies were telling on these rich people in New York. So these books were very popular. They were making movies about these books. And here's a fitness trainer who talked about 1 hour in Bel Air with a client. And boy, was it spicy. So everyone wanted, and they were offering me a ton of money to write that. And I said, you know, as much as I hate some of these people, I can't write that book. And now think about it, this was like 1999. This is, you know, the World Trade Centers were still up, right? This is pre 9/11. And they were like, well, you need to write this. You need to write this. And I said, no, as much as I hate some of these people, I can't do this to them. This is not why they hire me. Right. So I put it to bed for years. And when Dean Laurie started in on me around 2008 or 2009, right after the big, you know, financial crash, I kept saying, I'm not going to write a tell-all. And he stayed on me for a long time, which was unusual. And then finally, at some point, he said, I don't want you to write a book. I want you to read a book. And he asked me to read Kitchen Confidential by, what's his name? The guy who killed himself.
Anthony Bourdain.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
And I read that and I called Dean the next day and I said, oh, I think I know what you want me to write. I don't have to tell on these people. I can tell the stories and somehow mix fitness. So if I could keep people entertained and talk about the most boring subject on the planet, which is health and fitness, maybe that can become the thing. And who would have ever thought that that would, because at the time, no one was using the term keto. Nobody was talking about low carb. Nobody was talking about any of it when I was writing this book.
Right.
You know, the last time we heard about low carb, it was called Atkins, and that had been bastardized, right?
Yeah.
And I just started writing about it, you know, because you know, I knew who Stephen Finney and Jeff Volek were and all that, but no one else really did, you know. So it was like, what if I could just bring this to the forefront? You know, so, but that's a long-winded way of saying that's how it started.
Yeah, no, that's great. I mean, I always find that kind of fascinating, you know, the people's journeys to get there. And it does kind of come through the connection to Anthony Bourdain. I mean, it's not a tell-all about the people you've worked with, but it is something of a tell-all about how big box gyms work, for example. I love that section about, you know, how they get you in the door and they kind of pull all the little sales tricks and tactics on you to try to get you to sign up right away and all these sort of things. So there's a lot of those sort of insider tips and secrets and things which are also useful, I think, right? You know, like your tip about prepaying for a gym for the entire year so that you don't get dinged every month on the credit card without thinking about it, right?
And, you know, I don't even know if, you know, like I would force them to take my money up front because it was in the fine print. And, you know, money is still a legal trade for both public and it's written right on every dollar bill. This is for both public and private, and it's backed up by the federal government. I would have to explain that at gyms. I'm not sure. They would just probably tell me to take a hike nowadays, because when I pull out cash sometimes at the grocery store, the kids look at it as if to go, what am I supposed to do with this? Right? They look at cash as if you're some kind of mafioso. It's like, well, you're doing some kind of illegal trade. What are you doing with the $100 bill? You know, so yeah, you know, some of that stuff might not even fly today.
Yeah,
And
I've gotten that look.
Yeah.
And God forbid they have to make change, you know, have to get out an abacus.
An abacus, you think they know what an abacus is?
You know, that brings me to one question that I was curious about, because like I say, it's been a couple of years now. And you do talk about the big box gyms and how they work. And you mentioned sort of the smaller boutique gyms that are, you know, really focused on, there's somewhat probably a higher quality trainer who runs it, and you're working one-on-one with them. But it seems like there's been an explosion of different chains and types of gym, you know, so we've got the CrossFit and the Orange Theory, and we've got Solid Core and Floyd Mayweather's, you know, boxing gym. I'm just not naming the ones that are in walking distance of my house right now, actually.
Right.
And so I'm curious about your take on some of these other models, and what do you think of them? Good, bad, or indifferent?
I like it because, you know, people aren't moving enough. People are just sitting all day long now. We were never meant to sit the way we're sitting, right? And yeah, I like, you know, I don't care what flavor it is, as long as people get out and move. Mm-hmm. You know, it's sad that we have to pay so much money just to move, you know, because you have feet, you can walk outside, and, you know, but people need that extra motivation now. They won't, you know, right here, you know, I'm pointing to it right here in you can see the television through the mirror on this back wall. Yeah. Right. There's a television right up there. There's a rowing machine. I know you're a big rower. There's a Concept 2 and a Schwinn spinner right there. Right. So even though since the book, well, I fell in love with a woman somewhere around 2007, and she requires furniture. Go figure. So I have a house full of furniture, but my room down here, my man cave, so to speak, there's a chair, right? I can watch television, but if I'm watching football or something on Sunday, not most of it, that's a lie, because I might watch 3 games, but at least one game is either on a spinner or a rowing machine still. Okay. You know, we need to move. And I tell people all the time, it's like, think about what you're paying for those classes. And if you think you could be motivated to do it at home, boy, you could save a lot of money. I mean, my spinner is pretty rusty from all the salt and sweat that's fallen on it over the past 10 years. And the one before that, I rusted out to where I just had to throw it away. But that's one cost. That's one fixed cost. Mm-hmm. And it's very cost effective when you consider being able to do it at home. The other problem people have, you may not have space at home, but I used to live in pool houses, which were basically one room. And, you know, that's what it's like. I don't have room for a couch. I only have room for the whatever's right here, which was a spinner back in those days. Yeah. Yeah. But to that point, so we have a very, we live in the city, so we have a very small house, and my gym is a bag of rubber bands, and I do Dr. Ben's workout twice a week with you know, just one set of rubber bands. So you can make it happen, you know. Yeah, rubber band. People ask me about rubber bands all the time, and I say to them, rubber bands can kick your butt. You can kick your own butt with rubber bands when you do them correctly, especially when you do them slowly and controlled the way Ben would teach you to do them. you can get to failure, unlike with weights where, you know, the angle takes effect a lot of times. The rubber band, as you keep pulling, it gets tighter, so you have more resistance. So I can make an argument that bands are better than, you know, weights in several cases.
Yeah, yeah. So it's doable. And the other quote that I love of yours is, you know, keep it somewhere that you're going to trip over it, right? If, as far as home fitness equipment, because if you tuck it away somewhere, you're never gonna
You'll never
use
see it again. Yeah.
it. Well, if folks do, I just changed the setting, so you can unmute yourself. We got a pretty small group, so I don't think we'll have problems with a bunch of people talking at once. But if you'd like to talk to Vinnie, if you have a question you want to ask, or if you want to just pop something in the chat, feel free. Just want to open it up to any questions from the group.
Vinnie, Rich LaFace, how are you?
Who am I talking to? It only says iPhone next to your name.
Really? My picture's not on there?
Yeah, yeah, but it's so tiny on my end. I can
Oh,
see.
I got you. Yeah, so I liked in
My
your
friend
book-
Rich LaFace.
Oh, hi, Rich. It's a pleasure.
How are you? So Lagniappe, the section in your book is, I really enjoyed that part of it. The rest of it, I sort of knew a lot of that stuff, but the story about you and your personal, well, I think you used the word demons and you're working through a lot of stuff, I thought was a really interesting Lagniappe. I mean, you just laid it on there like, a Lagnappe's usually something quick, right? But you gave a long and detailed sort of story about grueling across the desert there. And I've driven that and it's hideous, right? But I thought that was really revealing and I really enjoyed that part of the book. So I mean, the other stuff is mechanical and I sort of know it and the stories were there, but the Lagniappe was great, I thought, anyway.
Thank you. That part was almost completely left out of the book. And I'm glad it's in there because, you know, two types of people read the book. People who want to get healthy and lose weight, but it turns out that it's become this big deal in the terminal community, cancer and whatnot, because a lot of people will hand it to a loved one and say, look, this guy was going to die. And then he rode a bike across the desert, you know, so I'm glad if that's helped anyone, I'm glad I added it in. And that's one of the sections when I brought it around to book companies. They were like, nobody knows, we can't even pronounce the word lagniappe. We don't know what it means. Nobody's from New Orleans. We got to take this out. Maybe we can make it a small chapter somewhere in the book. And I was like, no, it's going to stay like this because, you know, it's my book. So thank you for saying that.
Really enjoyable. Yep.
Dr. Ben, I see you're unmuted. Did you want to jump in?
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, Vinnie, you know, like myself, has been doing this a long time, and a lot of the questions I get asked over the last, now it's 50 years, you know, doing this, saying, how did you figure this out, or what's the germ, how did it get started? And I think I have a similar story, I think, to Vinnie. I mean, we were jocks, okay, and we used weights. Back when I used weights, I had to use weights when I was in college playing football. I had to use weights in my apartment because they didn't want skilled position guys to lift weights. I don't know if anybody goes back that far, you know. And I was, you know, I hate to be, you know, the older I get, the better I was, but I was a pretty fair athlete, pretty fast, pretty strong. And, you know, they thought it was going to slow you down. And I mean, that's how long ago I was doing this stuff. Okay. And I got into it and I followed some of the bodybuilders and the weightlifters and I got to know a bunch of them. But, you know, when you talk about low carb and when it came into to be popular, when people came to me when I first opened my Nautilus place with 6 machines in a factory building, 1974, okay, almost everybody wanted to lose fat and gain muscle. I mean, you didn't have to be a wizard to figure that out. And if you really think about that concept, that's really what metabolic health is all about. I mean, I'm in the body composition world. I mean, that's my job. You know, I can go into the detail about mitochondria and this and that, and how the benefits of keto and beta hydroxybutyrate. Okay, that's cool. But basically, if you put on more muscle or go through the process of that putting on muscle and you reduce body fat, in almost probably 90% of the cases, you're going to be more metabolically healthy. So what Vinnie did and what I did basically say, look, who are the leanest, people that seem to be the healthiest? And they were the people that exercise. I'm doing a talk on anti-aging now. And you know what? You know what the number one correlative to aging is, to longevity? Muscle strength. Not smoking, not diabetes, muscle strength. You know what the number two correlative is? VO2 max. How much oxygen can you consume? Okay. So right there, if that doesn't tell you that you live longer and your health span is not going to be improved, which means by the course of nature, your metabolic health has to be, if you're concerned with anti-aging, you have to be concerned with metabolic health. If you're concerned with metabolic health, you have to be concerned with diet and exercise. I mean, that's as simply as I can kind of present the thing.
To jump on what Ben is saying, couldn't agree more. And I was also, I'm a little younger than Ben. I was also under that regimen of, you can't lift weight, your bench press won't make you a good football player, or squats won't make you a good football player. You're just going to make yourself tight. And, I was one of, in the mid to late 70s, one of the first groups where we were proving that wasn't so. Now they do combines and they want to know your bench press and your squats and everything else. And that just wasn't around then. But one of the germs, when you mentioned the germs, Ben, that I figured out early on, because I was in the gyms from the time I was 8 years old, and I would watch these bodybuilders get ready for competition. And I didn't understand anything when I was a kid. I was just watching, I was just observing. And they all had this thing of, you need to eat a lot of carbohydrates because it gives you the energy to work out really hard. And of course, they all walked around with big guts on. And then right before competition time, they would shred themselves by eating, very low fat and very high protein. So it was basically autophagy taking over and everything else. And the thing that got me was these guys and women, mostly guys back then, only looked good on one day. And even when I got to LA and I was at Gold's Gym and down on Muscle Beach, they all looked good for one day. As a matter of fact, if Ben can probably attest to this, 2 or 3 days after the competition, you could not recognize the person that was in the competition as being that person. They would just blow it up that fast. And that's when I started because at some point I started modeling against my own will. And it was like, well, I can't look good one day. I have to look like this all the time, because they weren't hiring me for my face. They were hiring me for my abs. And the one thing I learned was, you can look like that all the time. And the reason the bodybuilders felt like crap was not just because they had cut out all of the carbohydrates, but they were also not getting enough water. They were trying to dehydrate themselves so that they can look shrink wrapped. And I realized, wait, I could just keep drinking water, right? I could just keep taking electrolytes and you'll keep losing weight. And then I noticed that, as long as I did that, and I would start mixing in things like eggs with the yolks and red meat and all this other stuff they were telling us in the late 80s, early 90s was bad for your health. It's like, wait, it's working. This Atkins thing seems to work, right? That was the first clues. And that's when I started using it with my clients, and I started getting success. As soon as I got to Hollywood, I was doing this, and I started getting success with the Playmates over at Playboy. That was the first quasi celebrities that were hiring me at the time. And it's like, wait, this is working for me. It works for them. It works for everyone. This is my dirty little secret, that you can live like a bodybuilder all the time. You just need to drink water. And then I started figuring out, you can inch it up. You can have more fat. And it doesn't seem to hurt anything. Yeah, there's no bloating but it was all just trial and error that came out of the whole bodybuilding world,
Yep.
So it didn't start with the theory or the because I know you have some medical background as from your undergrad, right? But it really
Yeah,
kind of
there was some of that. There was some of that in there in the back of my head, because a professor, that's when I started using fat. More than one professor, when I was in biology and kinesiology and everything, they would talk about, macronutrients, and they would say your body's preferred fuel is fat. And so that was always ringing in the back of my head. And then, I knew a few people in New Orleans, they used to call the Atkins diet, I don't know if you remember this, they called it the drinking man's diet. So if you were a drinker, you can do Atkins and still lose the pot belly or whatever. And so there was some of that was going on, that was always lurking in the back of my head, that fat was actually good for you. I had enough of that pounded in to play around with it. And I saw a program at one point, everything just kind of happens by happenstance, right? I saw a program where they were talking about longevity, these people who want to live to 100 and whatever years old. And they showed this one guy, and he was eating nothing but bacon and, bacon fat and all this kind of stuff. And, he was getting rid of the egg whites and only eating the egg yolks. And there was a bunch of that just started. I'm looking at this going, okay, Atkins. And, I'd read a lot about what was going on back in the early 1920s with, seizures and this ketogenic diet that was, so there was a lot that was playing into it. Right. Yeah. So I lost the fear of fat, if that matters, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
Well, I mean, if you see a bunch of, I hung around athletes. I still do. That's where I tend to drift. Okay. But if you see these guys, Vinnie, you remember Serge Nubret?
Yeah. That he had biceps bigger than his head. He died recently.
No, you're talking about Sergio Oliva.
Oh, Oliva. Oh, yeah.
But
I know exactly who you're talking about. Oliva had the bigger biceps.
Nubret right? Was the French guy, black guy. He's been phenomenal physique. And I met him at one of the Mr. Olympias. He just talked to a nice guy. What do you eat? The guy ate like 2 pounds, 2.5 pounds of meat. That's what he ate. And I'm saying this guy was cut and full and muscular, and he was a handsome dude, And I saw all these guys, and I said, they're healthy. I had friends who were cardiologists. We tested these guys. Their cardiac risk factors were like nothing, I said, well, this doesn't make, and personally, my experience was, I was in pretty good shape. I had, other than cholesterol, which is, we know now the science as to why your LDLs go up when you eat a low carb diet, blah, blah, blah. But everything else was perfect. I'd go into a doctor's office for an insurance physical, take off my shirt, and he goes, there's nothing wrong with you. This guy went to school for 22 years to tell me when I took off my shirt that I was healthy, right? But in any case, so you get this kind of a common sense, street kid saying, well, what they're saying is basically bullshit, because I know 1,000 people don't go by that model and are, doing fine and they're healthy. So something else has got to be in the equation that's screwing this up. It's not the meat, it's not the fat, And so, you're the same kind of thinker that I am. You're saying, if I can call bullshit on it and I really look into it, then there's got to be another answer, right?
Well, and maybe we could bring Dr. Newport into this, but I think sometimes doctors are handcuffed by, the medical community, where they're not allowed to, there was this kid, my stepdaughter was dating this kid before the current boyfriend, who was a third-year medical student. And he was basically telling me I was killing people, but he was smart enough to go and start doing a little research. And he came, I ran into him somewhere in town a year after they broke up, and he was like, I've changed my mind on everything. I'm sorry that I was so brazen about it, but wow, it's all right there. And he goes, they're not teaching it. They weren't teaching it at UVA. Mary, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. Well, medical school, I had 3 hours of nutrition one afternoon. That was it in 4 years. They really, and even now they're still not teaching nutrition, and that diet can cause disease, and diet can help overcome disease. That, yeah, and doctors are very protocol driven. Medicare expects you to do this step, this step, this step, this step. And for example, I thought it would be really cool, because I am very interested in, Alzheimer's, diabetes of the brain, and diabetes itself is a big risk factor for developing dementia and Alzheimer's, and wanting to help people who have insulin resistance and diabetes and pre-diabetes with a low carb diet. And I was looking into doing, mostly because of COVID, and doing telehealth and there was a group I was looking at, and they said, well, the only problem is you can't really, you have to go with this protocol that's a higher carb diet, not a low carb diet. And I said, forget about it. I'm not going to get involved in that, because, I don't believe that anymore. And, I really did, my medical school training, what they did talk about was eating a low fat diet. I mean, that was already there starting around the early 1960s. It kind of became official dogma around 1981. But, we were really taught, that low carb diet was not good. It was not healthy. And really that low fat is what we should be aiming for. And I adopted that myself, as my eating pattern. And then 1992, they come out with the food pyramid. I think you mentioned it in your book. It had, I think, 6 to 11 servings of grains on the bottom of the pyramid.
There was 11 on the bottom.
At the bottom. Yeah. And at the top, oil was like a tiny, added sugar and oil was like a tiny point at the top of the pyramid. And but I believed it. Who was I to, argue with them? I didn't have any, nutrition education in medical school. I just kind of told, and I ate that way myself, and it got me into trouble. I gained a lot.
It's funny because my grandparents and great grandparents had zero education.
Mm-hmm.
They were immigrants from Italy, and some of them barely spoke the language, but they all knew that if you ate too much bread and pasta, you got fat.
Right.
Yeah. It doesn't take,
Yeah.
you don't need to look at a freaking pyramid to do that math, and, it's almost like we know that these old immigrants know this,
Yeah.
yet somehow the government went, hey, here's a pyramid.
Yeah.
And, it's actually, if you take the 11 on the bottom, and then I think it becomes like 20 something servings per day. I can't remember.
It was a huge number and it was all grain and cereal. I mean, what they showed.
So how did my grandmother, who had a fifth grade education, know this information?
Right.
And my great grandmother, who, didn't speak very well English at all, how did they have this information? Yet,
that's how they ate. That is just how they ate. And I really feel like the American Heart Association turned everything upside down, in the 1960s and 70s, because even, when I was a kid, I would have like a 5 or 10 pound problem, when I was in my teens, and my pediatrician, what he would tell me, he said, cut out the sweets and the starchy foods. He was telling me to eat a low carb diet, and it worked. I mean, whenever I followed his advice, every summer I was on a swim team, diving team, and I would lose 10 or 15 pounds. And then I gained it back in the winter when it was cold and I didn't have access to our swim club. But he would tell me, cut out the sweets and starchy foods. And there was a Dr. Pennington in the 1950s. And he's really pre-Atkins. Atkins based his diet on Pennington's diet. And he was also, low carb and eating more healthy fat. And, but then, the American Heart Association comes along, and I bought that myself, hook, line, and sinker. And then, we'll talk more about my book the next time. But, the thing was coconut oil, and my husband, who had Alzheimer's, that it helped him. And I'm like, oh my God, this is fat. And we were told coconut oil was an artery clogging fat in medical school. And it was a little bit of a struggle at first, but then, as I read more and more, I came to realize that fat isn't bad, that eating low fat is not healthy, that, that's what we were missing. And that's why so many Americans have gotten obese and diabetes and dementia. It's just been escalating over the last 50 years.
And
Yeah.
and the story, as you tell it in your book, is so incredible,
Mhm.
Dr. Mary. And I'll put in a plug for Vinnie's
Yeah.
podcast. You were on that just a couple of weeks ago, right?
Yeah,
So if people
yeah,
want a
yeah,
little
Yeah.
preview of the book, you can check out that podcast
yeah,
episode. I can send it out in my my next post on the Substack.
yeah. And I
And
wanted to
I
say,
think
Vinnie's
okay.
book was so entertaining. I cheated and I listened to the Audible book, which is I enjoy it so much because he narrates the book and it was just it was so entertaining. I really couldn't stop listening. I listened to it all in one day basically.
Thanks, Mary. People always say to me, how did you have the forethought to narrate it? Because at the time, no one narrated their own books 10, 12 years ago. And I said, oh, it wasn't forethought. I was just too cheap to hire someone to go in and read it. So that was a forethought. And and I started riffing, and who knew that nobody was doing that back in the day.
Right.
Just riffing in between chapters and going, oh, this reminds me of this, that, and the other thing. And it kind of became another podcast.
Yeah, the bonus content. I remember that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Mine had a question, I think. If I can jump in. Yeah.
Hey, Vinnie, thanks for coming on. I've not read your book. I look forward to reading the book or listening to the podcast. Hey, just looking for some practical advice. I just turned 64. I'm about 220. I think I should probably be 195 or so. How do you motivate? How did you motivate, or do you motivate your clients to get going, get started? What practical tips generally would you have for someone like myself who knows I need to get down to that point, but need to get set off on that mission and do it? Have a little direction.
I'm a big fan of ripping the Band-Aid off, because diet, unlike a lot of things, you can't get a little bit pregnant with this, right? So, I do these consults every day, and I see Robin here and a few other people who maybe have had consults with me. And I always tell this story. Let's say you and your wife were at the age where you wanted to get pregnant. Your wife wanted to get pregnant. And let's say you're in your late 20s, early 30s. She's producing an egg every month, and the doctor's checking her, and he's perplexed as to why she's not getting pregnant. So he starts asking questions, and he goes, okay, wait, you're fertile. You have an egg every month. We've checked your husband's sperm. He's got a lot of swimmers, so that can't be the problem. How long have you been off of your birth control? She's like, oh, I've been off for 6 months. And are you guys having a lot of intercourse right when you're ovulating? Oh God, doc, we're banging like rabbits and the whole thing. And the doctor just becomes more and more perplexed. He can't understand why this woman's not becoming pregnant, right? And then the guy jumps in and goes, hey doc, you think it would help if I took my condom off? You see, it's one of those things where when people go, Vin, I'm not losing weight. I've lowered my sugar. I'm not eating as much. I'm still having some bread, but I'm having Ezekiel bread. Like that's some kind of special bread. Your liver goes, oh, it's Ezekiel bread. People will say, I've lowered this, I've stopped doing that. And when you lower things, you might see an adjustment, right? You might lose some inflammation, and you'll lose some immediate water weight, right? But unless you rip that Band-Aid off and just go, my wife is going off of birth control, she's ovulating, we're having sex, and I'm taking the condom off. We're doing all of it. If you don't do all of it, you're never going to get pregnant, right? You can't do 4 out of 5 things. So, and you might go, man, that's pretty harsh. What do you mean cold turkey? I mean, you can start right now, tonight, right? Just no more ice cream, no more chocolate, no more, I'm watching my favorite, version of whatever's on television. I'm, binge watching, Yellowstone or whatever people are binge watching now. If you just say, this is it, right? You won't just see that water weight leaving, you'll start seeing weight dropping. And not only that, you're going to see your triglycerides drop into a range most doctors don't think you could get into without medication. you're gonna see your A1Cs. You know, if you look at the commercials, they'll say if you're on metformin, Ozempic, and 3 other drugs, you might get down to a 7
Right.
A1C,
Right.
which is still perfectly sick. So you're taking 3 drugs to stay perfectly sick. Guess what? We as a community have a method that will take you out of type 2 diabetes with no medication, and it'll get you down below a 5. 5.6 is pre-diabetic or diabetic. You'll be 4.9, 4.8, no drugs. Not one drug on television will offer you that option. The drugs they tell you in the commercial, take this drug and you can stay perfectly sick. Perfectly sick. That's what they're telling you. So you can change that right now tonight by just ripping that Band-Aid off. Make sense?
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah. Jump right in.
But I think, too, Vinny, he said, how do I get started? You've already started because you're thinking about it and you're trying to make a plan. So that's what Vinny's saying is that you've got the impetus, you've got the energy to start doing this, you've got the interest. And what he's saying is, if you're going to, I'm going to take this medicine, but I'm only going to take a third of what's in the capsule. Well, you know what? The reason they did the research and spent $82 billion to figure out a drug is to say that a third of the capsule is not going to work. You have to get to a threshold level, a level at which your body is going to respond, upwardly consistently. That's really what we're talking about. Okay. It doesn't mean, 6 months from now, your daughter gets married, you can't have a piece of birthday cake, whatever. Okay. But there is a certain threshold which each one of our bodies is going to say store fat or burn fat. And for most of us, it means significantly cutting out from what we are used to, which is, people don't say, we say low carb diets. I say a normal carb diet, because the shit that we're eating is such a high carb diet, and relative to that, almost anything is better. But it's really, I think I call it controlled carbs. So, enough carbs so that your body can go through the chemistry that it needs to be healthy, but not enough so that we have an energy toxicity where we can't store this stuff in a good place. Once our storage places for glycogen and fat become overwhelmed, inflamed, spread out to other parts of the body where they're not supposed to be, we're screwed. How do you change it? You don't oversupply fuel. You reduce the fuel, and the fuel that's most likely the lowest hanging fruit is carbohydrate. I mean, this is pretty simple stuff, and it's pretty simple reinforceable chemistry. Am I wrong?
And by the way, I sound like Dr. Phil when I say stuff like this, but if you can perceive and conceive, you can achieve, right?
Yeah.
That's what athletes do. You put it in your head, you get a mental picture. What do I want to look like? Where do I want to be on January 1st, which is about a month from now? Most people start on January 1st. You could get a whole month head start right now, right? Just the perception, the conception, and you can achieve, right? It's really that simple. And people always, you look around, right? Tom Brady, right? The greatest of all time. He's slow. If you looked at his combine numbers, the guy shouldn't have ever played high school football, much less college or pro, right? Yet he's the greatest of all time because he can perceive what he wants to do, and then he achieves it, right? You just have to get that mental picture of what you want and then do it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Can I just jump in with one other tip? And this is going to sound like it goes against what you're saying, but I think it kind of actually works with, because when I started, I was on smoothies, yogurt, oatmeal, everything, exact opposite, low fat whole thing, and it wasn't working. And so I said, okay, week 1, I'm going to get breakfast in line. So I'm going to hard boil a dozen eggs on Sunday, and then each morning I'm bringing 2 of them to work. That's my breakfast. So that's all I worried about. And then week 2, I figured out what I was going to do for dinner, and then week 3, I figured out that I could just, make some salmon and vegetables for dinner the night before, and then throw that piece of salmon on the leftover salmon on top of a salad for the next day for lunch, a little olive oil. I've got lunch solved. So it can be, you know, it can be complicated when you get into the internet keto and all the little, you know, cloud bread recipes and all the things like that. But it can be as simple as you make it, you know, cutting out
Yeah.
sugars, cutting out grains, you know,
Good
couldn't be
advice.
simpler
Thank
than
you.
that. Yeah, yeah. I want to get to Powie because she's got her hand up over there. Powie, would you like to unmute?
Hi,
Hey.
hi, Vinny. I have
Hello,
a question. What's this? Like, how do you know what your numbers are? Like, I actually track macros, but as I adjust, like I gain and lose weight, how do I know what the safe number is and what I should be aiming for like protein? Like, how many grams of protein, how many grams of fat? Like, I know fat, I shouldn't go off under 40, so I never do. But then, like, even carbs, like how much carbs do I have? Like, just so I can ballpark, because it's really hard just figuring out how to get to that safe number.
There is no safe number. I'm, you probably don't know much about me, but I hate when people count. Counting is diet mentality, and diet mentality never works. It just doesn't work. Nobody from the Paleolithic era ever counted. They didn't even know what macros were, right? You know, I've been in the weight loss game for 40 years. And the one thing I know is people drive themselves crazy trying to figure out macros and counting and everything else. If you just, as I say, if you just make it high fat, moderate protein, and try to keep your carbs to zero, you're going to end up with, you know, somewhere between 30 and 60 grams of carbs per day. And that's just fine, right? You'll be fine with that. But you shouldn't try to crazily try to track. I mean, that's hard to do. It's almost impossible to do. And when you start using words like safe, you know, that's not where you want to be. That's not the life I want to live. You want to live that life counting macros and using words like safe when it comes to food? Think about that. I want you to think about that. Not think about what the macros should be. You know, Ben was saying, you know, low hanging fruit, get rid of sugar, get rid of, you know, I agree 100%. But if you're not losing weight, you need to start reassessing. Well, how much fruit, how much sugar am I having per day? How much am I really doing what I'm supposed to do? Because whenever people start calling me for consults, and they will start by telling me, I'm doing everything right. I lost 70 pounds. I'm still doing everything exactly right. And I stopped losing weight. And when I sit on the phone with them for half an hour, 45 minutes, it all starts coming out, right? The truth starts coming out. You have to be honest with yourself. Am I making any sense here?
How do I know if I'm eating enough? Do I just go by I'm full?
Yeah. When you're full, you stop.
Okay.
When you feel sated, you stop. I know this sounds like I always feel like I'm being condescending when I say this because you inherently know this stuff. I'm not being condescending. You eat, you feel sated, you stop. You might still have food on your plate. It doesn't mean you have to finish. You can scrape it together, put it in the fridge, have it later, right? We have modern refrigeration. We do not have to eat everything in front of us. We have freezers. We have microwaves we can reheat, right? Don't feel like you have to eat certain amount just because you're on some kind of crazy, I'm going to have these many macros and, you know, don't do it. You've eaten enough, stop. Right?
Yeah, and I want to say thank you to Robin for putting the link to the ebook in there, and that's you know, just such a great bargain. It's like what, a couple of bucks online, which really gives some info, because you know the point I wanted to get to, I think you mentioned that in the ebook, is that the hormones that regulate appetite, and a lot of people are out of whack because of our high carb, high sugar lifestyle, right?
Yeah.
And we're eating unnatural junk food, right? And when you start eating this way, the hormones start to balance, you know, find balance, and it starts to take care of itself. The appetite starts to take care of itself. You can actually trust that when you're hungry, you actually need food, things like that.
Yeah, and what he's talking about, Pauly, am I saying your name right, Pauly?
Howie,
Yes,
yeah.
Yeah.
Howie.
Um,
Yes.
we don't get fat based on calories as much as hormones, right? And if you got those switches in the wrong direction, if you're eating the wrong foods, you're going to feel hungry because your body's going to become resistant to leptin and ghrelin and everything else. And while that's happening, you're going to keep releasing insulin, which is going to turn most of those sugar calories into long chain triglycerides and store them as fats. So as long as you stay away from that stuff, you can keep the hormones working for you as opposed to against you. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And yeah, whoever put up the I can't see the chat, but whoever put up the PDF in the chat, go check that out. It's me nickel and diming people, but it's $10. Go get it. And that has changed more people's lives. I think Robin's husband, Matt, used it, right, Robin? Is that correct? A lot of it.
I couldn't unmute. Yeah, we've read it several times and shared it several times with others. That ebook has everything laid out for you for how to eat NSNG, and it's really very simple. Don't eat sugars, don't eat grains, and then the little caveat or seed oils. So seed oils are awfully inflammatory, so we don't want to eat those either.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Jim, yeah, thank you for joining us. The great
Thank
Jim
you.
Abrams is here, folks.
Hey,
Well,
Jim.
this is wonderful, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm a big fan of most of the people on your panel. I just wanted to point out that there is a difference between eating a ketogenically balanced diet for weight loss as opposed to a severe medical condition. And so there's a little bit of a course correction, but if you're on the diet for a severe medical condition, if you have a brain tumor, if you're experiencing severe epilepsy, stuff like that, it is important to count.
Yeah.
And it is important to work with a trained dietitian who can help you calculate exactly what you should be counting. And so in the modern era with the diet, those two applications have gotten a little confused because it's gone from this just medical applications to I want to lose 20 pounds by my next 15 years or 10 whatever. And so I think it's really important for us to keep that, to distinguish between using the diet for weight loss, in which case, if you miss a day, okay, you missed a day. If you're using it for severe epilepsy and you miss a day, you can die.
Yeah.
So it's important to count.
By the way, folks, you guys can see Jim at the beginning of my first movie, Fat, a Documentary. It opens with him and a picture of his cute son, Charlie. Let me give him a plug, charliefoundation.org. You can go check that out. And Beth Zupikania is the dietitian there. If anyone who has any sort of problem, brain tumors or epilepsy or any of the stuff that the ketogenic diet can help, the very first stop is Charlie Foundation. You're going to get more information on that site. I send people to that site daily. That's a lie, but weekly. I send people to that site. And by the way, Jim is also one of my favorite comedic writers, wrote some of the funniest movies of all time, for my generation at least. I don't know if kids today even know about Airplane and all those great movies. But thank you for all of it, Jim.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jim, for bringing that up and for really being my transition, because again, as I tell in my book, right, I found about NSNG and got into it and began to enjoy it, whatever. And then your appearance on Vinnie's podcast is what made me sit up and say, wait a minute, I have epilepsy. Maybe I should be looking into this thing. And so that was really what started the whole journey. I mean, my book would not exist with you two guys, without you two guys right here. And can't thank you, either of you, enough, you know, and how much you've changed my life. So.
Wow.
One man came from the Midwest, one came from the swamps of Louisiana, but somehow.
Well, I know we're over time. Are there any other quick questions before we let?
I
Vinnie and
did
Oliver-
I missed the first few minutes of this podcast, but I did hear the part where everybody was struggling to figure out where that food pyramid came from.
Yes.
And I don't know whether you got into Ansel Keys or not, but he had a lot to do with the predicament that we're still in today.
Yeah, Dr. Bocchicchio mentioned 1960, or maybe Dr. Newport mentioned 1960. And I think when we hear 1960, we automatically go right to Ansel Keys.
Yeah.
I think that's, yeah. What a disaster.
What a disaster.
Yeah. One of my favorite reads on that whole disaster is Nina Teicholz's, Big Fat Surprise, and just the history of the demonization of fats. And it reads like, it reads like a murder novel.
You should do her book. After you do Mary Newport's book, you should do Nina. People always say, what's the first book I should read? And it's like, probably Gary Taubes' second book on the subject and Nina Teicholz's only book on the subject. Those are my two favorite. That I don't even send people to my own book. I send them to those two books because they're more convincing than my book, way more convincing.
Yeah, great books. So that's exactly the order that I'd read them in too. And so yeah, we'll put that on the schedule. And she's great. I interviewed her for my book as well. And she's just a really warm, giving person and wonderful. Vinnie, any parting words for us before we break up the party here?
Yeah, look, all of this is just as easy and just as tough as you want to make it. Your desire to be healthy and live a long life has to be stronger than, eating junk. Because people always say to me, Diet Cokes, I can't give up my Diet Cokes. And, I can't give up. But I love beer. Do you love it more than living? Because it's going to be a pretty short and kind of crappy life, right to the end, unless you do things right. And, it's up to you. No medical, the government's not going to help us. Medicine's not going to help us. You got to do it for yourself. You have to advocate for yourself.
So true. Thank you. The perfect words to end on here. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. Thanks for being here. I'm just blown away by all these awesome people who showed up, and I look forward to doing some more of it next month. So once again, quick plug, Clearly Keto, Dr. Mary Newport.
Thank you.
Read it. Come back next month and we'll have more awesome conversations like this one.
Thank you guys for putting up with me. I appreciate it.
They will.
Yeah, nice to see all of you.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Bye guys.